Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about heroes conquering mountains, but about ordinary folks conquering whispers. In our world of instant judgment and social media trials, we forget that every person carries a story deeper than their reputation. This tale from 1880s Colorado reminds us that grace can bloom in the hardest ground. Clara's hands shook as coins scattered across Henderson's general store floor. The metallic clinking echoed through the sudden silence like church bells gone wrong. "Some women just don't belong in decent company," Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice cutting through the morning air sharp as winter wind. Every eye turned. Every conversation stopped dead. Clara dropped to her knees, scrambling for the scattered pennies. The smell of pickled barrel brine and fresh ground coffee filled her nostrils as she crawled across floorboards worn smooth by honest boots. Her calloused fingers found each coin while folks stepped deliberately around her crouched form. The wooden floor bit cold through her patched calico skirt. Shame burned hotter than the pot-bellied stove crackling nearby. What dark secret followed this woman like a shadow, turning neighbors into judges? Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The dust cloud rolled down Main Street like flour shaken from a sifter, coating the wooden sidewalks in fine powder that made Clara's nose itch. She pressed her fingertips against the boarding house window, leaving smudges on glass that already needed washing. A lone rider emerged from the brown haze, his horse favoring its left front hoof. Clara could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice carrying from the front porch, pitched high with the practiced cheerfulness she used for paying customers. "Course we got rooms available. That girl there handles the serving duties." Clara's stomach clenched tight as a fist. Here it came, the usual dance of polite rejection wrapped in acceptable excuses. But the stranger's voice cut different than most. "Food's food, ma'am. Don't reckon it matters much who carries the plate." The words drifted through the open window, along with the scent of dust and horse sweat. Clara wiped the glass clean with her apron sleeve, squinting at this tall man who spoke like common sense, still walked the earth. His clothes carried the honest dirt of hard travel leather vest, darkened with sweat stains, work shirt that had seen plenty of washing, boots that knew their business. An hour passed before Clara climbed the stairs with his water pitcher, each step creaking under her feet like the old house was announcing her approach. The hallway smelled of lye soap and the lavender sachets Mrs. Patterson tucked behind the curtains to make the place seem respectable. "Room 3. Clara knocked twice with her knuckles. "Come ahead." She pushed the door open. He sat on the bed's edge, pulling off trail-dusty boots that had walked more miles than most folks could imagine. When he looked up, something fluttered in Clara's chest like a trapped sparrow beating its wings. The man stood up straight and removed his hat completely, didn't just touch the brim like most men did when they remembered their manners. He held that worn Stetson against his chest and nodded once, deliberate as Sunday church, like she was somebody's wife, somebody decent. The water pitcher slipped from Clara's suddenly nerveless fingers. Ceramic shattered against pine floorboards, water spreading in dark stains that would leave marks Mrs. Patterson would complain about for weeks. "Oh," the sound escaped before she could catch it. "Happens to the best of us, miss." His voice held no irritation, no judgment, just plain fact stated plain. "I'll fetch a mop if you tell me where to find one." Clara stared at the broken pieces scattered around her shoes. In 3 years of hauling water to men's rooms, not one had ever offered to clean up after her clumsiness. Who was this stranger who looked at her like she mattered? And what did he want that was different from all the rest? The coffee had turned cold in Clara's hands while she stood outside his door. No steam rose from the thick ceramic cup anymore. The brew had darkened from brown to black, bitter grounds settling at the bottom like her own sinking courage. She knocked twice against the pine boards, soft taps that barely carried through the wood. "Come ahead." Jacob Miller sat by the window with a ledger spread across his lap, pencil stub worn down to nothing between his weathered fingers. Numbers filled the pages in neat rows, his careful script recording the business of men who owned land and cattle and futures that stretched beyond next week's rent. "Brought you coffee." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He closed the ledger with deliberate care, setting it on the side table where dust motes danced in the lamplight. The kerosene flame flickered behind glass, casting shadows that moved across his face like thoughts he wasn't ready to share. "Much obliged." He accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment, calluses rough as tree bark, warm as sun-heated stone. Clara lingered by the table, her hands empty now, but reluctant to leave. Through the window, she could see fireflies blinking their Morse code messages across Mrs. Patterson's vegetable garden. "Porch gets a nice breeze this time of evening," Jacob said, his tone matter-of-fact as discussing weather. "You're welcome to sit a spell if you've got the time." The words hit Clara like cold water. Men didn't invite her to sit. They took what they wanted and pointed her toward the door. But something in his voice, ordinary as discussing the price of grain, made her nod before her better judgment could interfere. The porch swing creaked under their combined weight, rope supports groaning against the hooks Mrs. Patterson had screwed into the ceiling beams last summer. Clara perched on the edge, spine straight as a fence post, hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for punishment. Jacob settled back into the swing's curve. One arm stretched along the wooden backrest. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms marked with the accumulated scars of outdoor work. Old rope burns from breaking horses, cuts from barbed wire that had healed crooked. A life written in permanent ink across his skin. "You work powerful hard," he said. Clara's fingers worried the worn fabric of her skirt. The cotton was soft from countless washings, thin enough that lamplight showed through the weave. "Hard work never killed anybody." True enough. His coffee cup rested on his knee, both hands wrapped around the ceramic for warmth the evening air didn't require. "But working hard don't always get folks what they deserve." The swing moved in slow arcs, chains squeaking with each pass. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the porch light, a whippoorwill called its name over and over, the sound cutting through night air sharp as a preacher's conviction. Clara's throat tightened, words pushed against her teeth, demanding release after years of swallowing them down. 3 years of choking on truth until it turned to poison in her belly. No decent man wants damaged goods. The confession escaped like steam from a kettle left too long on the fire. Sudden and scalding and impossible to take back. Jacob's cup stopped halfway to his lips. He lowered it slow as molasses, ceramic meeting wood, with the softest click. His weathered fingers drummed once against the porch rail, a single, thoughtful tap. Minutes stretched between them like taffy in the sun. The whippoorwill called again, answered by its mate somewhere near the stable. Horses snorted and shuffled in their stalls, leather creaking as they shifted weight from hoof to hoof. "Woman who works hard as you do." Jacob's voice carried no pity. No judgment, just observation delivered plain as cornbread. Any man worth his salt would count himself lucky. Clara's hands clenched in her lap, fingernails digging crescents into her palms. You don't know what I am, what I was before. Know you get up before the roosters every morning. Know you scrub floors till your knees bleed raw. Know you mend other folks' clothes by lamplight when you could be sleeping. He paused, studying her face in the flickering light. Know you got more grit in your little finger than most people carry in their whole bodies. Her breath caught sharp as swallowing glass. The night air suddenly felt too thick to breathe properly. House needs someone who cares about it, Jacob continued, his voice steady as bedrock. Needs someone who'll tend the garden when it's dry. Fix the roof when it leaks. Make it home instead of just walls and timber. Clara's vision blurred. Salt stung her eyes, threatening to spill over and mark her as weak when she needed to be strong. She blinked hard, forcing the tears back where they belonged. Come to Colorado with me. The words hit like a physical blow. Every muscle in Clara's body went rigid, her spine straightening until it might snap. What? Got a ranch there? Good land? Water rights that won't fail come drought years. His fingers drummed that single tap against the rail again. Needs a woman's hand to make it into something more than just a place to work cattle. The porch swing stopped moving. Clara's feet pressed flat against wooden planks, halting their gentle motion. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something caged and desperate for freedom. I'm not. She swallowed hard, trying again. I'm not the marrying kind. Neither was I. Jacob's smile was barely visible in the lantern light, just the slightest upturn at the corner of his mouth. Till tonight. Clara stared at him. This quiet stranger who talked like sense still ruled the world, who looked at her and saw something besides shame and scandal and the kind of woman decent people crossed streets to avoid. Why? The question tore from her throat, raw and desperate as a prayer. Why me? Jacob set his coffee cup on the porch rail with careful precision. When he looked at her, his eyes held something she'd forgotten existed in this world, something that made her chest ache with possibilities she'd buried deeper than winter graves. Because you know what it costs to keep going when everything's against you. That's worth more than all the respectability money can buy. The whippoorwill called once more, its voice echoing across the sleeping town. Clara's hands trembled in her lap, her carefully constructed walls cracking like ice in spring sun. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, something dangerous and bright that she'd thought was dead and gone forever. What if he meant it? What if this wasn't just another man's passing fancy, destined to end in disappointment and deeper shame than before? What if she had the courage to find out what came next? Clara's bare feet wore grooves into the boarding house floorboards, back and forth across the narrow room, heel to toe, toe to heel. The old pine planks creaked under her weight, like bones settling, each step marking time in a rhythm that matched her thundering heartbeat. The carpet bag sat open on her bed, brass corners tarnished green from years of storage. Inside, her mother's wedding ring quilt lay folded with military precision, every hand-sewn stitch visible in the lamplight. The pattern emerged like a promise kept interlocking rings in faded blue and white, each one representing hopes her mother had stitched through winter nights when Clara's father was off chasing work that never came. Clara lifted the quilt from the bag, unfolding it across the bed's patched coverlet. The cotton squares still held faint traces of lavender water and wood smoke, scents that belonged to better times when decent folks had called her family neighbors instead of charity cases. She pressed her face into the fabric. breathing deep. The smell of her mother's hands, patient and gentle, even when creditors pounded on their door demanding payment for medicines that hadn't saved anyone. The floorboard under the window groaned as she stepped on it again. How many times had she walked this path since full dark 50? 100. Her feet knew every loose nail, every warped board that sang under pressure. This room had been prison and sanctuary for 3 long years. Come morning, it would just be walls and furniture that meant nothing to nobody. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, Mrs. Patterson making her nightly rounds, checking locks and snuffing lamps to save on kerosene. Clara held her breath until the sounds faded toward the stairs, then resumed her pacing. She folded the quilt again, hands moving by memory learned at her mother's knee. Back into the bag it went, along with her father's leather Bible. The cover was soft as butter from handling, pages loose at the spine where countless desperate fingers had turned them seeking comfort that never came quite strong enough. 2 mother-of-pearl combs, chipped at the edges but still catching lamplight like promises half-kept. A bar of lavender soap, cracked down the middle but too precious to waste. Everything she owned in this world fit inside a carpet bag that wouldn't fill a child's arms. The traveling dress hung from a nail driven into the wall, dark wool dyed with walnut hulls. Practical as dirt, and twice as plain. She'd sewn it herself from fabric bought with coins, saved penny by penny. Skipping meals until her belly cramped with hunger just to afford decent cloth. Clara pulled the dress over her head, wool scratching against skin that hadn't known silk or satin since childhood. The fabric smelled of the cedar chest where she'd stored it, mixed with the faint traces of hope she'd stitched into every seam. Outside. Church bells tolled 5 o'clock. Dawn still hid behind the mountains, but the town was stirring like an anthill disturbed by curious feet. Roosters crowed from hen houses behind white cottages where respectable women would soon emerge to start their respectable days. Clara picked up the carpet bag, its weight pulling at her shoulder like everything she'd ever been reduced to 10 pounds of memories and necessities. The leather handle was worn smooth where her father's hands had gripped it, back when he'd believed better days waited just beyond the next county line. The stairs creaked under her feet as she descended into the boarding house's main hall. Each step carried her further from safety and closer to whatever judgment waited on Main Street. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting her black dress like snow that wouldn't melt. Steam rose from the coffee pot behind her, carrying the promise of bitter comfort Clara would never taste in this house again. "You're making a fool's mistake, girl." Mrs. Patterson's voice held no warmth, just the certainty of someone who'd never questioned the rules that kept her world spinning smooth. "Mark my words, you'll come crawling back inside a month with your tail between your legs." Clara's fingers tightened on the carpet bag handle until the leather bit into her palm. "Could be you're right. Men like him don't marry women like you. They use you up and throw you away like yesterday's dishwater." Mrs. Patterson's pale eyes glittered with the satisfaction of someone delivering unpleasant truth. "Soon as the novelty wears off, he'll remember what you really are." The words hit like fist blows, but Clara kept walking toward the door. Her hand found the brass knob, turned it with steady pressure despite the tremors running through her fingers. "I appreciate your concern. Mrs. Patterson." Morning air rushed in when she opened the door, carrying the scent of dew-wet grass and possibilities that smelled sweeter than any perfume. Clara stepped across the threshold, leaving the boarding house behind like old clothes that no longer fit. Main Street stretched before her like a battlefield marked with invisible trenches. Curtains twitched in windows as word spread through the town's network of gossips and busybodies faster than wildfire through dry grass. The auction girl was leaving with that stranger, finally getting what was coming to her. Clara's spine straightened with each step away from safety. Her heels clicked against wooden sidewalk planks, marking steady rhythm like a funeral drum leading mourners to fresh graves. The carpetbag swung at her side, no longer pulling her down, but pushing her forward into whatever came next. Henderson's General Store loomed ahead like a courthouse where sentences got handed down without benefit of jury trial. Through the front window, Clara could see Mrs. Henderson arranging bolts of fabric with the precision of someone who believed order could control chaos. Their eyes met through glass streaked with morning condensation. Mrs. Henderson's mouth pinched into a line thin as paper, her hands stilling on the calico she'd been straightening like soldiers in formation. A cluster of women gathered near the store's entrance, Mrs. Morrison from the parsonage, the blacksmith's wife, whose name Clara had never bothered learning. 3 or 4 others whose faces blended together into a single mass of disapproval. They stood close as crows on a fence rail, their dark dresses and pinched expressions marking them as judges in a court that never offered appeals. Clara, Reverend Morrison stepped into her path, black coat billowing in the morning breeze like wings of some great carrion bird. His face carried the weight of pastoral concern, eyebrows drawn together in what passed for Christian compassion among folks who'd never needed any themselves. Child, think about your reputation. Clara stopped walking, set her carpetbag down with careful precision, brass corners clicking against wooden planks worn smooth by the passage of people with places to go and purposes worth pursuing. When she looked up, her voice carried the steady certainty of someone who'd found bedrock beneath shifting sand. Already lost that, Reverend. Can't lose what you never had to begin with. The Reverend's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water and left gasping for air it couldn't breathe. Behind him, the gathered women whispered among themselves, words buzzing like wasps disturbed from their nest. Clara picked up her bag and resumed walking. Past the blacksmith shop where hammer blows rang against anvil steel, keeping time with her heartbeat. Past the millinery where ribbon-trimmed bonnets sat in the window like accusations of vanity she'd never been guilty of purchasing. The wagon waited at Main Street's end, where the road split toward distant mountains that looked close enough to touch, but never seemed to grow any nearer. Jacob Miller sat on the driver's bench, reins loose in his weathered hands, like a man who understood that some things couldn't be hurried. He didn't check his pocket watch or tap fingers against the wooden seat, just waited with the patience of someone who knew that courage came in its own time and couldn't be rushed like bread rising in a warm oven. His eyes met hers across the dusty street. No smile, no wave, no gesture that would give the gossips more ammunition for their eternal war against anything different. Just acknowledgement that she'd chosen to walk toward whatever came next, instead of hiding from it behind familiar walls. Clara's feet found the rhythm of her heartbeat steady and strong, and pointing towards horizons she'd never dared imagine reaching. Behind her, whispers grew louder like wind building before a storm. Ahead, the unknown waited with possibilities that terrified and thrilled in equal measure. But as she approached the wagon, one thought crystallized clear as mountain water for the first time in her adult life. She was choosing her own path instead of letting others choose it for her. The question that would haunt her until she found the answer was simple as breathing and complicated as living. What would this choice cost both of them before it was through? The wagon wheels found their rhythm on the third hour out of town. Thump, creak, like a heartbeat with a stutter that rattled Clara's teeth together. She gripped the wooden seat with both hands as another rut jolted through her spine, jarring every bone from tailbone to skull. Jacob's weathered hands moved with the reins, his wrists absorbing each shock before it could travel up his arms. When the wagon hit a hole deep enough to swallow a cat, he glanced sideways at her white knuckles. "Road smooths out past Miller's Creek," he said, his voice steady despite the constant bouncing. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to stay level. Her backside had gone numb somewhere around the second hour, and her lower back burned where the seat edge cut into muscle that hadn't been made for this kind of punishment. The canvas cover overhead snapped in the wind like laundry on wash day. Jacob had rigged it from bent willow branches and flour sacking patched in places where field mice had chewed through the fabric during winter storage. It kept the worst of the sun off her face, but did nothing for the dust that coated everything in fine powder the color of dried blood. Behind them, the town had disappeared into heat shimmer and memory. Ahead, the road stretched toward mountains that looked close enough to touch, but never seemed to get any nearer. Grassland rolled away on both sides, broken by creek beds lined with cottonwoods and the occasional windmill marking some homesteader's hopeful claim. Clara's stomach cramped with hunger, but pride kept her from mentioning the gnawing emptiness below her ribs. They'd left before breakfast, and she figured Jacob probably expected her to carry her own weight without whining about discomfort like some city woman who'd never known hardship. The sun climbed toward noon, beating down through the canvas with furnace heat that made her wool dress cling to her skin like a punishment. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, soaking the fabric until it felt heavy as chainmail. "Stream up ahead," Jacob said, nodding toward a line of trees that broke the endless grass. "Good place to rest the horses and stretch our legs." He guided the team down a gentle slope toward water that sparkled between willow roots like scattered coins. The horses pricked their ears forward, nostrils flaring at the scent of moisture in the dry air. Their hooves splashed into the creek bed, sending rings across the surface that caught sunlight and threw it back in dancing patterns. Jacob set the brake and climbed down, his boots squelching in creekside mud that smelled of fish and wild mint. He moved around the wagon with practiced efficiency, unhitching the team and leading them to water where they dropped their heads and drank with the grateful urgency of desert travelers. "Best stretch those legs," he called over his shoulder. "Still got 6 hours of daylight left to cover ground." Clara climbed down from the wagon seat, her knees buckling when her feet touched solid earth. Pain shot up her legs as circulation returned, followed by the uncomfortable prickling of awakening nerves. She gripped the wagon side until the world stopped swaying like a boat in rough water. The creek ran clear over smooth stones, maybe 2 feet deep at its center, where minnows darted between shadows cast by overhanging branches. Clara knelt beside the water and cupped her hands, drinking until the ache in her throat eased. The water tasted of minerals and wild places, nothing like the sulfur-tainted well water she'd grown used to in town. Jacob returned from tending the horses with a cloth bundle from beneath the wagon seat. He untied the corners, revealing thick slices of ham and bread wrapped in oiled paper that kept the flies away. "Figured you might be getting hollow about now," he said, offering her a generous portion. Clara's mouth watered at the sight of real food, not scraps left over from other people's meals, but thick-cut ham and bread baked with honest flour. Her hands shook as she accepted the food, and she had to concentrate to keep from wolfing it down like a starving animal. They ate without much talk, watching the horses drink their fill while red-winged blackbirds perched on cattail stems nearby. The birds' scarlet shoulder patches blazed bright against brown marsh grass that rustled in the breeze like whispered secrets. "How much further to Colorado?" Clara asked, when her stomach finally stopped gnawing at itself. "Week, maybe 10 days depending on weather and road conditions." Jacob wiped his hands on the grass beside him, then rolled his sleeves up another turn to catch the breeze. "Road gets rougher once we hit the high country, but the views make up for the bumps." Clara tried to imagine 10 more days of this jolting, bone-jarring travel. Her body already felt like it had been beaten with fence posts. How would she survive a week more of punishment that made her current misery feel gentle, as if reading her thoughts? Jacob walked to the wagon and returned with a folded blanket and a small pillow stuffed with something that crinkled when he squeezed it. "Corn husks," he explained, noting her questioning look. "Softer than bear wood, and they hold their shape better than feathers. Should have thought to offer it sooner." Clara stared at this simple kindness that no one had required him to show. Men in her experience took what they wanted and gave nothing back unless forced by law or circumstance. This one anticipated her needs before she voiced them, then acted without making her feel like charity case. "Thank you," she managed, the words coming out thick with more gratitude than cushioned seat warranted. Jacob nodded and began hitching the horses back to their traces. Clara arranged the blanket on the wooden seat, marveling at how such a small thing could feel like luxury when you'd been doing without. The sun hung low and red when Jacob finally called halt for the day. They'd stopped beside another creek, this one wider and deeper, with grass thick enough for the horses to graze without hobbles. Jacob unhitched the team while Clara climbed down, her legs more steady now, thanks to the cushioned seat. "Know anything about making camp?" Jacob asked. "Leading the horses to water." Clara shook her head, embarrassed by her ignorance. She'd lived her whole life in towns and boarding houses where someone else built the fires and cooked the meals. "Nothing to it once you get the hang of it," Jacob said without judgment. Just matter-of-fact teaching. "First thing is water for coffee creeks right there. Second thing is firewood." He showed her how to gather dry branches from beneath the cottonwoods, breaking them over his knee to test their soundness. Wet wood smoked and wouldn't catch. Punky wood crumbled to powder between your fingers. She needed pieces thick as her wrist, but not so big they'd burn too fast and waste heat. Clara's arms filled with suitable branches while Jacob used his folding knife to shave tinder from a piece of birch bark. His hands moved with the confidence of long practice, curling wood shavings that would catch flame from a single match strike. The fire grew from spark to blaze under his careful feeding, each stick placed to create draft underneath the flames. Heat warmed Clara's face, while smoke stung her eyes and made them water. "Your turn tomorrow," Jacob said, settling back on his heels. "Fires like anything else practice makes it second nature." From the wagon, he produced a blackened Dutch oven and a granite coffee pot dented from years of trail use. The oven had 3 short legs that let him set it directly over coals scraped from the main fire. "Biscuits," he explained, seeing her watching. "Takes about 20 minutes if the coals are just right." Clara had never seen a man bake bread. In her world, men expected women to do the cooking while they handled horses and business and other masculine responsibilities. But Jacob moved around their camp kitchen with easy competence, measuring flour by handfuls and adding salt from a small crock. "Never knew a man who could make decent coffee," Clara said, accepting the tin cup he handed her. The coffee was strong enough to float horseshoes, but smooth as silk going down. Clara wrapped both hands around the warm metal, letting steam bathe her face while the fire crackled between them. "Had to learn or drink mud for 15 years, Jacob replied, settling back against his saddle with his own cup. "Coffee's too precious to waste on bad brewing." As full darkness settled around their small circle of firelight, Jacob reached into his shirt pocket and produced a piece of pale wood and his folding knife. His hands began moving in small, precise cuts, curls of shavings falling into the fire where they sparked and disappeared. "What are you making?" Clara asked. "Nothing special, just keeps my hands busy while I think." The knife blade caught firelight as it moved. Carving shapes Clara couldn't identify in the dancing shadows. Jacob's face was calm, focused on the work without being consumed by it. This was a man comfortable with silence, content with simple tasks that served no purpose except filling time peacefully. "City fellow came through my ranch last spring," Jacob said, his voice taking on a storytelling cadence. "From back east somewhere, Philadelphia. I think. Real proper gentleman with a black suit and store-bought boots, shinier than Sunday collection plates." Jacob's posture straightened into pompous dignity, his voice climbing to mimic refined Eastern accent. "First morning, this fellow comes to breakfast and finds a spider in his coffee, jumps up like his britches were on fire, starts hollering about unsanitary conditions and frontier barbarism." Jacob pressed one hand to his chest in theatrical horror, eyes wide with exaggerated shock. "My good man," he says, "this establishment falls far short of civilized standards. I shall be departing immediately for more suitable accommodations." A sound escaped Clara's throat, half snort, half giggle that she tried to catch with her hand. But laughter bubbled up anyway, breaking free like water through a cracked dam. The sound rang across the prairie, bright and musical and completely unexpected. Clara hadn't laughed in 3 years, hadn't even smiled except when serving customers demanded it. But Jacob's ridiculous impression of the dandified city man struck her as the funniest thing she'd ever heard. "Best part," Jacob continued, grinning at her reaction. "He'd paid for a week's room and board in advance. Rode off in a huff, leaving me with money in my pocket and one less fool to cook for." Clara's laughter died as quickly as it had come, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable as a turtle without its shell. Ladies didn't laugh like that, loud and unrestrained and common as barnyard chickens. She pressed her lips together, mortified by her lapse in proper behavior. But Jacob's expression held no criticism, just quiet pleasure at having coaxed joy from someone who'd forgotten how to find it. The fire popped, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. Night sounds began around them, the splash of a fish jumping in the creek, the rustle of small creatures moving through grass, the distant yip of coyotes testing their voices against the darkness. "Jacob." Clara's voice came out smaller than intended. "Yeah. What I said back in town about being damaged goods." She stared into the flames, unable to meet his eyes. "You should know what you're getting yourself into." Jacob's knife stilled against the wood. He looked up from his carving, studying her face in the flickering firelight with the patience of a man who'd learned that some stories came in their own time. "Don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share." "But I want to." The words rushed out like water over a broken dam. "Because you're being kind to me, and kindness deserves honesty in return." Jacob set down his knife and wood. Giving her his full attention, the fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across his weathered features that made him look like someone carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves. Clara drew a shaky breath and began to speak to the flames, telling them what she'd never told another living soul. About the auction block where desperate women sold themselves to keep from starving. About the men who'd bought her time and considered everything else their right to take. About the shame that followed her like a faithful dog, marking her as permanently soiled in the eyes of decent society. Her voice stayed steady through the telling, years of buried pain flowing out like infection from a lanced wound. Jacob listened without interruption, his breathing quiet and regular as a sleeping child's. When she finished, silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Clara's chest felt hollow, scraped clean by confession. She'd expected judgment, disgust, maybe the sound of him hitching up the horses to take her straight back to town. Instead, Jacob picked up his knife and wood, resuming his carving with the same steady rhythm as before. "That why you work so hard?" he asked finally. "Trying to prove you're worth something?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to stay level. "Woman proves her worth every day just by getting up and facing whatever comes." Jacob's knife moved in careful strokes, shaping something from the pale wood. "Past don't change that. Present's what matters most." And a coyote howled somewhere to the south, the sound rising and falling like a question asked of the empty sky. The horses lifted their heads from grazing, ears pricked toward the sound, then returned to their peaceful business when no threat materialized. "Besides," Jacob added, returning to his carving, "we all got things we'd rather forget. Difference is, some folks get to keep their mistakes private, while others wear them like scarlet letters pinned to their chest." Clara studied his profile in the firelight, wondering what secrets lived behind those calm eyes. What mistakes had shaped the man who spoke of forgiveness like it was water instead of wine too precious to share. But before she could frame the question, a new sound cut through the night air. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders approaching fast, their horses breathing hard like they'd been pushed to cover ground quickly in darkness that made such speed dangerous. Jacob's hand moved to the rifle propped against his saddle, his body going still as a hunting cat that had caught scent of prey. Who would be riding hard after dark in country this empty and wild? And why did every instinct in Clara's body scream that whoever was coming through the darkness meant trouble for a man traveling alone with a woman like her? The hoofbeats thundered closer through the darkness, then slowed to a canter. 3 riders emerged from the night beyond their firelight, horses blowing hard through distended nostrils. Steam rose from the animals' flanks in the cool air. White vapor that spoke of hard miles covered at dangerous speed. "Evening, folks," called the lead rider, a lean man with a badge pinned to his vest that caught firelight like a star. "Sheriff Morrison from Millfield. You seen anything unusual on the road today?" Jacob's hand relaxed on his rifle stock but didn't move away from it entirely. "Define unusual." "Sheriff, bank got hit this morning. 3 men, rode out heading west on the main road." The sheriff's eyes swept their camp, taking inventory of the wagon, the hobbled horses, Clara's presence by the fire. "Mind if I ask where you folks are bound?" "Colorado, my ranch up in the high country," but Jacob's voice stayed level, neither defensive nor overly helpful. "Been traveling since first light." The sheriff nodded, apparently satisfied by what he saw a man and woman making honest progress toward an honest destination. His companions sat their mounts in silence, letting him handle the questioning while they watched the darkness beyond the fire's reach. "Ma'am?" The sheriff touched his hat brim toward Clara with the automatic courtesy Western men showed all women. regardless of station. "You traveling of your own free will with this gentleman?" Heat flushed Clara's cheeks. Even in the cool night air, even here, miles from anywhere, questions followed her like smoke that couldn't be outrun. "Yes, sir, I am." "Well then." The sheriff gathered his reins, leather creaking in his gloved hands. "Sorry to trouble you, good people. Keep your eyes open for anything that don't look right. Those men we're tracking aren't the sort you'd want to meet on a lonely road." The three riders spurred their horses back into the night, hoofbeats fading until only cricket songs and the snap of burning wood remained. Jacob watched until they disappeared completely into darkness before setting his rifle aside. "Law moves fast out here when it needs to," Clara observed. "Has to. Not many places to hide in country this open." Jacob banked their fire with dirt, leaving just enough coals to restart it come morning. "Best get some rest. Long day ahead tomorrow." 5 days passed in the rhythm of wheels turning and weather changing. Clara's hands toughened from handling reins when Jacob spelled the horses. Her back adapted to the wagon seat's unforgiving surface, learning to roll with the motion instead of fighting every bump and rut. She discovered how to read clouds for signs of rain, how to spot good water from bad by the color of vegetation growing near creek beds. Jacob proved himself a patient teacher, explaining without condescension, correcting mistakes without losing his temper. He showed her how to hobble horses so they could graze but not wander far, how to pack gear so nothing rattled loose on rough roads, how to gauge a creek's depth before attempting a crossing that might swamp their wagon. At night, around small fires built from buffalo chips and dry grass, he spoke of his ranch with the careful pride of a man who'd built something worth keeping. 2,000 acres of grassland and timber, a house he'd framed with his own hands from logs cut on his own land, corrals built from split rails he'd hauled down from mountain slopes. "Water rights are the key to everything," he explained one evening, whittling another small figure from pale wood. This one looked like a horse, though Clara couldn't be certain in the flickering firelight. "Man can survive without gold, without fancy store-bought goods. But water—" He shook his head. "Wood shavings falling into the flames. Water's what separates the living from the dead in this country." Clara listened to these descriptions with growing unease that settled in her stomach like stones swallowed with supper. The boarding house where she'd worked required managing meals for 8 travelers at most. Jacob spoke of operations involving dozens of cattle, seasonal hands for branding and roundups, supply runs that took weeks to complete. What did she know about managing a household that fed working men who'd expect hot meals 3 times daily? How could she oversee root cellars and preserve enough food to last through mountain winters that could last 6 months? Her experience extended to scrubbing floors and mending torn stockings, not running what sounded like a small town disguised as a working ranch. On the 6th morning, Jacob pointed toward a gap between 2 ridges where morning light caught on something that flashed like metal or glass. "Home," he said, the single word carrying more weight than a speech. The ranch spread before them like a promise carved from wilderness and built with human sweat. The main house rose 2 full stories, with a wraparound porch supported by peeled log posts thick as a man's waist. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney that looked solid enough to outlast the mountains themselves. Clara's throat constricted as she took in the scope of what Jacob had built from nothing but determination and back-breaking work. This wasn't some hard-scrabble homestead carved from wilderness by folks too poor to know better. This was prosperity, stability, the kind of operation that took years to establish and careful management to maintain through good seasons and bad. Outbuildings dotted the valley floor like pieces on a giant checkerboard. A barn that could house 20 horses stood beside corrals built from split rails weathered silver by sun and mountain weather. A bunkhouse long enough to sleep a dozen men stretched parallel to the main house, smoke rising from its chimney as well. A windmill turned lazily in the morning breeze, metal blades catching sunlight as they pumped water from deep underground. 3 men emerged from the barn as their wagon approached, ranch hands, by their clothes and the easy way they moved around horses and leather. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who knew their work and did it well, their eyes assessing Clara with polite curiosity. "Boys," Jacob nodded to them as he set the wagon brake. "Clara, meet Tom, Pete, and young Billy here. They keep this place running when I'm fool enough to leave it in their hands." Tom, the oldest of the 3, touched his hat brim with fingers darkened by rope work and weather. "Ma'am?" Gray streaked his brown beard, and old scars marked his hands like permanent reminders of lessons learned the hard way. "Welcome to the Triple M." Pete and Billy followed suit with their greetings. Polite, but reserved. They'd wait to see what kind of woman Jacob had chosen before deciding whether to approve or merely tolerate her presence in their ordered world. Clara climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady after hours of travel over increasingly rough roads. The men went about unhitching the horses with practiced efficiency, leaving her standing beside Jacob in the middle of his carefully ordered kingdom. "House needs work," Jacob said, as if reading the overwhelmed expression she couldn't hide. "Been letting things slide since I've been managing alone." He led her up porch steps worn smooth by boot leather and weather, opening the front door onto a large room with exposed beam ceiling and stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole steer. Furniture stood arranged with masculine practicality chairs built for comfort rather than show. A table scarred from use, but still solid as the day it was made. But it was the kitchen that stopped Clara cold as a mountain lake in winter. The cast-iron range dominated one wall like a sleeping giant. 6 burner plates gleamed black as midnight, with warming ovens above and baking compartments below that could hold enough bread to feed a small army. A water reservoir attached to one side promised hot water for washing and cooking. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, designed to hold enough dishes and supplies to stock a restaurant. Clara stood in the doorway, calculating the scope of what would be expected from her. Breakfast for how many men ate 10 during spring roundup and fall shipping season. Lunch packed for riders heading to distant pastures that might keep them gone for days. Dinner substantial enough to satisfy appetites built by hard physical labor that started before dawn and ended after dark. Her experience extended to boarding house cooking for travelers passing through town. Simple meals made with basic ingredients, nothing that required real skill or planning ahead. This kitchen demanded expertise she didn't possess, confidence she'd never had chance to develop. Previous owner was a German fellow, Jacob explained, noting her stunned silence. Had this range shipped special from Chicago. Takes some getting used to, but it'll cook anything you put on it once you learn its moods. Clara's hands trembled as she approached the massive stove. The burner plates alone were larger than any cooking surface she'd ever used. Draft controls, dampers, fireboxes, all requiring knowledge she didn't have, and mistakes she couldn't afford while feeding hungry men who depended on her competence. Root cellars through that door there, Jacob continued, pointing toward steps leading down into darkness. Smokehouse out back for curing meat. Springhouse keeps dairy fresh even in summer heat. Each addition to the tour deepened Clara's growing sense of panic. Root cellars required understanding seasonal preservation, knowing which vegetables stored well and which spoiled at first opportunity. Smokehouses meant managing meat through various stages of curing and drying. Springhouses involved dairy work, churning butter, making cheese, keeping milk sweet when temperatures climbed. "How many men work here regular?" Clara asked, dreading the answer but needing to know the full scope of her responsibilities. 3 year-round, like you just met, up to 8 during spring roundup and fall shipping. Jacob opened cupboard doors, showing her stores of flour, beans, coffee, sugar that looked like supplies for a military campaign. Previous cook left some recipes written out. Old Pete knows the basics if you get stuck on something. Old Pete. Clara seized on this information like a drowning person grabbing for rope. At least someone here understood the kitchen's demands and might help her navigate the learning curve without embarrassing herself completely. But even as relief flickered in her chest, reality reasserted itself with crushing weight. She'd be expected to take charge, to plan meals and manage supplies and coordinate with ranch operations she didn't understand. Men would depend on her to fuel the work that kept this place running smooth as clockwork. What happened when she failed? When her inexperience resulted in burned meals or spoiled food or supplies running short at critical moments? Would Jacob's patience extend to repeated disasters? Or would he eventually realize he'd made a terrible mistake bringing her to a place that required competence instead of just willingness to work hard? The sun was setting by the time Jacob finished showing her through the house. Upstairs bedrooms with windows facing different directions to catch morning and evening light. A parlor with built-in bookcases and comfortable chairs for reading during long winter evenings. A washroom with an actual bathtub luxury Clara had only imagined owning. It was everything a woman could want in a home. Everything except the certainty that she was capable of caring for it properly. That night, Clara lay in the guest bedroom Jacob had shown her, staring at ceiling beams that seemed to press down like the weight of expectations she couldn't meet. Through the window, she could see lights burning in the bunkhouse where the hired men were probably discussing their boss's questionable judgment in female companionship. Tomorrow they'd expect breakfast, real breakfast, hot and substantial and ready on time. They'd judge her competence by how well she filled their plates and kept their coffee cups full. One disaster would mark her as another failed experiment. Another woman who'd looked better from a distance than up close. Clara pulled the quilt over her head, trying to muffle the voice in her mind that whispered what everyone back in town would say when she returned in defeat within the month. But beneath the familiar fear, something else stirred. Something stubborn and desperate that refused to accept failure without a fight. She'd survived worse than an oversized kitchen and demanding men. She'd learned harder skills than cooking for ranch hands. The question wasn't whether she was good enough to manage Jacob's household. The question was whether she had enough courage to fail a few times while learning to succeed. And that question would be answered tomorrow morning. When 8 hungry men came to the kitchen, expecting their new cook to know what she was doing, Clara's hands shook as she lifted the cast-iron skillet from the range top. Gray smoke poured from beneath the blackened lumps that had once been biscuits, filling the kitchen with the bitter stench of burned flour and ruined breakfast. Her eyes watered from the acrid clouds billowing around her face like fog from hell's own kitchen. The biscuits had turned to charcoal rocks, hard as stones and twice as inedible. Gravy congealed in the saucepan like wet cement, lumpy and gray where she'd added flour too fast while panic made her hands clumsy. Coffee boiled over on the back burner, hissing against hot iron and sending more smoke into air already thick enough to choke a horse. through the kitchen window. She could see the men walking toward the house from morning chores. Tom carried a milk pail that sloshed white foam against dented metal sides. Pete wiped his hands on a rag, probably cleaning off honest dirt from feeding cattle while she destroyed their breakfast. 8 hungry men expecting hot food and finding smoking disaster instead. Clara grabbed a dish towel and began fanning smoke toward the open window, but the gesture was useless as trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teacup. The damage was done. The kitchen looked like a battlefield, covered in flour dust and grease spatters, burned crumbs scattered across pine floorboards where she dumped the ruined biscuits in desperation. The back door creaked open. Tom entered first, his nose wrinkling at the smell that hit him like a physical blow. Pete followed. Then Billy. Then the others whose names she hadn't bothered learning yet. They filled the kitchen doorway like a jury assembled to witness her complete failure as a woman. "Morning, ma'am," Tom said, his voice carrying the careful politeness men used around situations requiring diplomacy. "Smells like you're having some trouble with that big stove." Clara stood amid the wreckage of breakfast, holding a smoking skillet while surrounded by evidence of her incompetence. Soot streaked her apron black as mourning clothes. Flour dusted her hair white as an old woman's. Her hands were grimy with grease and burned food that made her look like she'd been wrestling with the devil himself. "I can make more," she managed, though the words came out cracked as broken pottery. "Just need a few minutes to— Don't trouble yourself none, ma'am." Pete stepped forward, taking the skillet from her trembling hands with the gentleness reserved for handling injured animals. "We can rustle up something simple. Happens to everybody when they're learning." But it was the careful kindness in his voice that cut deepest. The tone men used with children or feeble-minded folks, people who couldn't be expected to manage adult responsibilities. Clara had heard that voice before, in boarding houses where managers made excuses for her mistakes to impatient guests. The men filed out quietly, probably heading to the bunkhouse, where they'd make do with whatever simple food they could cobble together from their own supplies. Clara stood alone in the smoky kitchen, surrounded by physical proof that she was exactly what everyone had always said a woman who looked better from a distance than up close. She was still standing there, staring at the disaster. When hoofbeats approached from the direction of the main road, Clara wiped her filthy hands on her ruined apron and peered through the window, dreading what she might see. A buggy rolled up the drive, pulled by a matched pair of bay horses that gleamed with good care and regular grooming. The woman climbing down from the driver's seat wore a dark blue dress that fit her substantial frame without pulling at the seams. Her hat was trimmed with ribbon that matched her dress exactly, and her gloves were clean white kidskin without a single stain. Everything about her spoke of prosperity and social standing and the kind of respectability that Clara would never possess, no matter how hard she scrubbed or how carefully she minded her manners. Mrs. Wallace, Clara had heard Jacob mention the name, their nearest neighbor, wife of the banker who held mortgages on half the valley's struggling ranches. The kind of woman who kept detailed mental records of other people's shortcomings and shared them with anyone who would listen. Clara's stomach cramped with dread as she watched Mrs. Wallace approach the front porch with the measured step of someone used to being received with deference. This was the worst possible timing for a social visit, when smoke still hung in the air and Clara looked like she'd been rolled in flour and dragged through a coal bin. The front door's brass knocker sounded 3 sharp raps that echoed through the house. Clara smoothed her hair with soot-stained hands, knowing the gesture was useless, but unable to stop herself from trying. "Mrs. Miller, I presume?" Mrs. Wallace said when Clara opened the door. Her voice carried the automatic authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. She stood on the threshold like a general surveying conquered territory, pale eyes taking inventory of Clara's disheveled appearance. "I'm Beatrice Wallace. Welcome to our little valley." Clara opened her mouth to correct the name assumption, but Mrs. Wallace brushed past her into the house before she could speak. The older woman's nostrils flared slightly as kitchen smoke followed them into the front parlor. "Having some difficulties with domestic arrangements. I see," Mrs. Wallace observed, her gaze sweeping the room and noting yesterday's coffee cups still sitting on the side table, dust gathering on the mantelpiece where Clara hadn't found time to clean. "Keeping house for a working ranch requires certain capabilities." The word hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. Capabilities that Clara clearly lacked. Capabilities that any proper woman would have learned at her mother's knee instead of picking up in auction houses and places decent women didn't mention in polite company. "Jacob's never been one to fuss much about housekeeping," Clara said, hating how defensive she sounded. "Jacob deserves better than not much fussing," Mrs. Wallace replied, moving through the parlor like a health inspector hunting for violations. "A man of his standing in the community needs a wife who can represent his interests properly. Social obligations, you understand. The banker's barbecue next month. Church social every Sunday after services." Each word landed like a physical blow against Clara's already bruised pride. She'd never attended a banker's barbecue in her life. Wouldn't know how to behave at one if she tried. Church socials were gatherings for respectable women who could discuss their children's accomplishments and their husbands' business successes while serving food that didn't taste like charcoal. "Of course," Mrs. Wallace continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "Not every woman is suited for the responsibilities that come with marrying well. Some are better equipped for simpler arrangements." The shame burned in Clara's chest hotter than the smoking stove had burned her breakfast. Mrs. Wallace knew exactly what Clara was, and exactly what kind of arrangement had brought her to this ranch. The knowledge showed in every carefully chosen word, every meaningful pause. "Poor Jacob." Mrs. Wallace shook her head with theatrical sympathy that fooled no one. "Such a good man, taken in by a pretty face and a sad story. Men can be so trusting when it comes to women who know how to play on their better nature." Clara's face burned with humiliation hot enough to ignite the smoky air around them. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that Jacob had seen something worth saving in her. But how could she argue when evidence of her inadequacy filled every room of his house? Mrs. Wallace moved toward the door, her inspection complete and her judgment rendered without possibility of appeal. "I do hope things work out for everyone concerned, though experience suggests that certain kinds of women find it challenging to change their essential nature." The buggy wheels crunched on gravel as Mrs. Wallace departed, leaving Clara standing in the parlor like a defendant after sentencing. Through the window, she could see the older woman's straight back and perfectly arranged hat, the physical embodiment of everything Clara would never be, no matter how hard she tried or how much she wanted to belong somewhere decent. Full darkness had fallen by the time Clara climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom, each step feeling like walking through mud that sucked at her boots. The carpet bag sat on the bedroom chair where she'd left it that morning, still partially unpacked because some part of her had known this moment would come. Clara lifted the bag onto the bed and opened the brass clasps with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Her mother's quilt folded into familiar corners like it was relieved to be going home. Father's Bible found its place beside the cracked bar of lavender soap. The mother-of-pearl combs, chipped but still catching lamplight like broken dreams. Everything she'd brought to this place fit in the same space it had occupied before, as if the past day had been a fever dream that left no physical trace, just the bitter aftertaste of hopes raised high enough to make the fall hurt worse. Clara carried the bag downstairs, moving quietly to avoid disturbing anyone who might try to talk her out of the only sensible decision she'd made since leaving town. The kitchen still smelled of smoke and failure. Dirty dishes sat piled in the sink, where the men had left them after making their own breakfast, while she hid upstairs like a scolded child. The front porch welcomed her with cool night air and the sound of crickets calling from grass she'd never learned to call home. Clara settled on the wooden steps, carpetbag beside her like a faithful dog that had waited patiently for this inevitable moment. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human disappointment and broken promises. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed their evening contentment. Night sounds of a working ranch that would continue operating long after she'd become another cautionary tale about the dangers of reaching above your station. She'd lasted exactly 1 day. Not even a full day, just one disastrous morning that had stripped away every pretense about her fitness for this life. Mrs. Wallace had simply stated what everyone could see. Clara didn't belong here. Would never belong anywhere that required competence instead of just willingness to work hard at simple tasks. Bootsteps sounded on the porch boards behind her. Slow, deliberate footfalls that could only belong to one person. Clara didn't turn around. Couldn't bear to see disappointment in Jacob's face when he realized she was already packed and ready to spare him further embarrassment. The footsteps stopped directly behind her chair, close enough that she could hear his breathing, steady and calm, as always. Close enough to smell leather and wood smoke and the honest sweat of a man who'd spent the day doing useful work while she'd been destroying his kitchen. Clara. His voice held no anger, no recrimination, just her name spoken like a question that needed answering. But what answer could she give that wouldn't sound like another failure of nerve? How could she explain that some people were meant to build lives while others were meant to tear them down? And she'd finally learned which category she belonged in. The question was whether Jacob would try to stop her from leaving, or if he'd already realized that some mistakes were too expensive to repeat. Jacob's boots scraped against the porch boards as he lowered himself onto the step beside her, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from his body after a day's work. But not touching, just present. Solid as the mountains that ringed his valley in darkness. "Running away's easier than staying to fix what's broken," he said, his voice carrying no judgment, just observation delivered plain as morning coffee. Clara's knuckles went white around the carpetbag handle. "I can't do this. Jacob, today proved that clear enough. Today proved you don't know how to work that stove yet." He rolled up his left sleeve, exposing his forearm to starlight, even in the dim light. Clara could see the puckered scars that ran from wrist to elbow like a map of old pain. "See these marks, burned myself 4 separate times learning that cursed range. Still do. Sometimes. When I'm not paying proper attention." Clara stared at the marks, raised tissue that spoke of real burns, serious enough to leave permanent reminders, evidence of his own struggles with the kitchen equipment she'd assumed came natural to everyone else. "First year I owned this place, I poisoned 3 horses with moldy hay because I was too proud to ask old Pete which feed was fit to use." Jacob's voice held the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting weather patterns. "Nearly lost my best breeding mare, cost me $200, and almost broke my heart watching her suffer for my ignorance." He pointed toward the barn, where lamplight showed through gaps in the board walls. That building there, built it twice. First time, I didn't dig the foundation deep enough. Spring thaw shifted the whole structure 6 inches off square. Second time, I miscalculated snow load for the roof. Whole thing came down in the blizzard of 78, crushed half my winter hay supply. Clara's grip on the carpet bag loosened slightly. But you knew ranching. This is your land, your work. I don't know anything about knew nothing when I started. Jacob's interruption was gentle, but firm. Spent my first winter eating beans and hardtack because I hadn't learned to preserve meat properly. Near froze to death in a cabin that leaked heat faster than I could make it because I'd chinked the walls all wrong. The night air carried scents of hay and horses, clean smells that belonged to this place he'd built through trial and error that had cost him money and pride and probably years off his life. Clara breathed deep, letting familiar ranch odors steady her racing pulse. Point is, Jacob continued, learning takes time, takes making mistakes and cleaning them up and trying again till you get it right. Nobody expects perfection on day one, leastways. Nobody with sense does. Mrs. Wallace expects it. Mrs. Wallace expects everyone to fail so she can feel superior about their troubles. Jacob's voice carried dry humor that reminded Clara why his stories around the campfire had made her laugh. Woman married above her natural station and never lets anyone forget how grateful they should be for her presence. Clara turned to study his profile in the starlight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and weather for 30-odd years. She said you deserved better than what I could give you. She say that before or after she inspected the house for dust and counted the dirty dishes in the sink, despite everything. Clara's mouth twitched at the accuracy of his assessment. Mostly. Figures. Jacob stood, brushing dust from his pants with movements that spoke of bone-deep weariness. Come on, got something to show you before you make up your mind final. Clara followed him off the porch, leaving the carpetbag beside the steps like an abandoned hope. He led her around the house to the kitchen garden where rows of vegetables grew in neat furrows, their leaves silver-touched by moonlight. See that section there? Jacob pointed to a bare patch of ground surrounded by a low fence made from scrap lumber. That's where I tried to grow tomatoes my first season. Planted them too early. Didn't protect them from late frost. Lost every single plant. He moved to another section where bean poles stood empty against the night sky. These were supposed to be climbing beans. Planted the seeds upside down, didn't even know beans had a right way up. Took 3 tries before I figured out which end was supposed to face the sky. Clara followed him through the garden, listening to his catalog of agricultural disasters delivered without embarrassment or self-pity. Corn planted too thick that produced ears no bigger than a man's thumb. Squash that rotted on the vine because he'd watered them wrong. Carrots that came up twisted and bitter because he'd left rocks in the soil. Garden looks mighty fine now, Clara observed, noting the healthy plants despite his litany of past failures. Took 5 years to get it producing proper. 5 years of old Pete shaking his head at my mistakes and showing me better ways to do things. Jacob stopped beside a section of late cabbage, the heads full and firm in the moonlight. Pete's the one taught me about soil and seasons and timing. Without his patience, I'd still be buying vegetables at town prices and calling myself a rancher. They walked back toward the house, passing the chicken coop where hens rustled on their roosts with soft clucking sounds. Clara could see her carpetbag still sitting on the porch steps, patient as a faithful dog waiting for its owner's decision. That offer still good? She asked, surprising herself with the question. Which offer would that be? Building something together, instead of me trying to prove myself worthy of what you've already built." Jacob stopped walking, turned to face her directly, his expression serious in the moonlight that made his weathered face look carved from stone. "Clara, I didn't bring you here to be my hired cook or housekeeper. Brought you here to be my partner. There's a considerable difference between the two." The word hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. Partner implied equality, shared responsibility, mutual support through success and failure both. It meant Jacob saw her as someone capable of growth, not someone who needed to arrive fully formed and perfect. "I'll probably burn breakfast again tomorrow," Clara warned. "Probably will. So will I if I'm the one doing the cooking." Jacob's smile was barely visible in the darkness. "We'll take turns burning things till we both figure out what we're doing." Dawn light streamed through the kitchen windows when Clara came downstairs, finding Jacob already standing at the cast-iron range. He poked cautiously at something sizzling in a large skillet, his movements careful as a man handling dynamite. "Coffee's ready," he said without turning around. "Bacon's almost done if I haven't ruined it. Thought we might tackle biscuits together this time, 2 heads being better than 1 and all." Clara poured coffee into thick ceramic cups, grateful for the familiar ritual that steadied her hands. The kitchen still smelled faintly of yesterday's disaster, but morning light made everything look more manageable, less like a battlefield, more like a workspace where folks could learn from their mistakes. "You know how to make proper biscuits?" she asked. "Know the theory from watching Pete often enough." Jacob moved the bacon to a plate lined with brown paper. "Something about not working the dough too much, keeping everything cold, getting the oven temperature just right." Clara opened the flour barrel and began measuring ingredients into a large wooden bowl darkened by years of use. Jacob watched her work, occasionally asking questions about proportions and technique that made her realize she knew more than she'd thought from years of helping in boarding house kitchens. Working together felt different than struggling alone while everyone watched and judged. When Clara's hands shook while rolling out the dough, Jacob steadied the rolling pin without taking over the task. When she hesitated about oven temperature, he opened the firebox and adjusted the damper based on flame color and the heat radiating against his palm. The first batch came out golden brown and properly risen. Not perfect, some were slightly lopsided, others a bit too brown on the bottom but edible, definitely edible. "Think the men will notice they're not completely round?" Clara asked, arranging the biscuits in a cloth-lined basket that smelled of honest bread instead of smoke. "Think they'll be too grateful for hot food to worry about geometry?" The back door opened as if summoned by the smell of successful cooking. Tom entered first, followed by Pete and the others. Their nostrils flared appreciatively at scents of fresh bread and properly cooked bacon instead of yesterday's disaster. "Morning, ma'am," Tom said, his voice holding cautious optimism. "Smells considerably better in here today." "Mr. Miller helped," Clara said, surprising herself by sharing credit instead of taking sole blame or praise. "Turns out that big stove takes 2 people to manage proper." Pete's weathered face creased into something resembling approval. "Most things worth doing work better with partnership. Takes wisdom to know when to ask for help, instead of stubborn pride." The men filled their plates with bacon and biscuits, their movements efficient and grateful. Clara watched them eat, noting which items disappeared fastest and which remained largely untouched, information she could use to plan better meals, adjust quantities, learn their preferences through observation rather than guesswork. "Ma'am," Billy, the youngest hand, approached with his hat in his hands and flour dust on his sleeves from morning chores. "That coffee's about the finest I've tasted in months." Mind sharing how you made it so smooth. Clara's chest tightened with something she hadn't felt in years, pride in work well done. Recognition of competence earned through effort, rather than accident. Half cup of grounds for every 2 cups of water. Let it boil exactly 3 minutes, then move it off direct heat to settle. Much obliged. Billy nodded seriously, as if she'd shared vital intelligence instead of basic cooking knowledge. After breakfast? Pete lingered while the other men headed out to daily chores. He moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, checking the stove's firebox and adjusting dampers with practiced efficiency that spoke of years managing this equipment. "That sourdough starter's been acting temperamental lately," he said, nodding toward a ceramic crock on the counter that bubbled softly. "Might need feeding more regular. Happy to show you the routine if you're interested in learning." Clara nodded eagerly, recognizing the offer for what it was: acceptance. Not of her current abilities, but of her potential to learn and improve given proper guidance and patient teaching. The morning passed in small victories and shared tasks that built confidence like bricks in a foundation. Clara learned the rhythm of the kitchen pump that provided water for washing dishes. Jacob showed her how to gauge the oven's temperature by counting seconds with her hand held inside. Pete explained the mysteries of sourdough maintenance with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge shared was knowledge preserved. By noon, Clara had successfully prepared lunch for 8 hungry men without burning anything or reducing herself to tears. The accomplishment felt modest, but significant proof that competence could be built one small success at a time, rather than summoned whole from nothing. She was washing the last lunch dish when hoofbeats approached from the main road. Through the window, Clara could see another visitor coming up the drive. But not Mrs. Wallace this time. A man on a dark horse, riding with the urgency of someone carrying news that couldn't wait for convenient timing. Jacob emerged from the barn to meet the rider, their conversation too distant for Clara to overhear clearly. But she could read tension in the set of Jacob's shoulders, concern in the way he removed his hat and ran fingers through hair that needed cutting. When the rider departed and Jacob walked toward the house, his expression carried the weight of whatever message had been delivered. News that would test whether their fragile new understanding could weather storms larger than burned biscuits and wounded pride. What crisis was riding toward them on that messenger's horse? And would their partnership survive whatever challenge was coming to test bonds still too new to trust completely? 3 months later, Clara's knife moved through the onions in steady rhythm, blade rocking against the scarred cutting board with the confidence of long practice. Tears streamed down her cheeks from the sharp fumes, but her hands never paused in their work. 8 men would expect supper in 2 hours, and the beef stew required time to simmer proper if the meat was going to be tender enough to satisfy appetites built by October roundup work. The kitchen had become hers through small battles won and daily victories earned. She knew exactly which damper setting produced perfect biscuit heat, how long coffee needed to boil for Tom's preference versus Pete's stronger taste, which burner plate ran hottest without scorching pan bottoms. Knowledge earned through burned fingers and ruined meals, but earned honest. Steam rose from the cast-iron Dutch oven where beef chunks browned in their own fat. Clara stirred them with a long wooden spoon darkened by months of use, listening to the satisfying sizzle that meant proper heat and good searing. The onions went in next, filling the kitchen with rich aroma of meat and vegetables, combining into something that would stick to working men's ribs. "Smells like heaven's own kitchen in here," Billy said, appearing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and mud on his boots from checking water troughs. At 19, he still carried the eager politeness of someone raised to mind his manners around women. "Got those supplies from town like you asked for?" Clara wiped her hands on her apron and checked his list against the items spread across the kitchen table. Everything accounted for flour, sugar, coffee beans, the special baking powder that made her biscuits rise higher than Pete's old sourdough method ever managed. "Mrs. Henderson say anything about quality?" Clara asked, examining the flour sack for signs of weevil damage or moisture that would ruin a whole batch of bread. Billy's face reddened slightly above his collar. "She asked how you were settling into ranch life. Seemed surprised when I told her you've been managing the household accounts and such." Clara's mouth quirked upward at one corner. Mrs. Henderson's surprise would be genuine women like Clara weren't supposed to demonstrate competence in respectable areas like financial planning and supply management. They were expected to fail spectacular, confirming everyone's beliefs about character and breeding. "She say anything else worth repeating?" "Asked if Mr. Miller was satisfied with his arrangement." Billy stumbled over the polite euphemism, clearly uncomfortable repeating town gossip. "Told her Mr. Miller seemed right pleased with how things were working out. Don't reckon she liked hearing that much." Clara returned to her stew preparation, adding carrots and potatoes with the methodical care of someone who'd learned that consistency produced better results than inspiration. Mrs. Henderson's opinion mattered less with each passing day, though Clara doubted the woman would ever completely abandon her disapproval. The back door opened to admit Pete, his boots caked with mud from checking fence lines in the north pasture. He hung his hat on the wooden peg beside the door, a habit Clara had established when she'd grown tired of sweeping dried mud from kitchen floors 3 times daily. "Storm moving in from the west," Pete announced, accepting the coffee cup Clara handed him without being asked. "Should hit tomorrow evening if the wind holds steady. Might want to bring in extra firewood for the house." Clara nodded, already calculating adjustments needed for weather-bound men who'd be stuck indoors with hearty appetites, but no outdoor work to burn off energy. Extra bread for tomorrow's baking. Maybe a larger pot of soup that could stretch over multiple meals if the storm lasted longer than expected. These small domestic calculations had become second nature, like breathing or walking, managing supplies, predicting needs, coordinating meals with ranch operations skills she'd developed through repetition rather than formal training, but real skills nonetheless. "Jacob still planning that ride into town tomorrow?" she asked. "Wanted to check with you first. Bank business can wait if you'd rather not make the trip with weather turning ugly." Clara considered the muddy roads and cold rain that would make travel miserable as wet cats. Against that, she weighed the satisfaction of walking into Henderson's store with money in her pocket and competence in her bearing, showing town gossips what 3 months of partnership could accomplish. "I'll go," she decided. "Need to place an order for that lamp oil that doesn't smoke up the chimneys." The ride to town took 2 hours through landscape painted in autumn colors that burned bright against gray storm clouds gathering on the western horizon. Clara sat beside Jacob on the wagon bench, her traveling dress now cut from store-bought wool instead of home-dyed cotton. Not fancy, but respectable looking in the way of women who could afford quality fabric and proper tailoring. Town looked smaller than she remembered. Main Street shorter, and the buildings less imposing than they'd seemed 3 months ago. Distance and time had shrunk the place that once loomed over her like a prison built from other people's opinions. Now it was simply where she conducted business, bought supplies, interacted with folks who might approve or disapprove but couldn't control her future. Jacob pulled up in front of the bank. setting the brake with movements made smooth by long practice. "Meet you at Henderson's in an hour or so." Clara nodded and climbed down from the wagon, her boots landing solid on wooden sidewalk planks that had once seemed to burn beneath her feet like coals. Today, they felt like ordinary lumber supporting ordinary footsteps. Henderson's general store buzzed with familiar activity of women examining fabric bolts and children pressing noses against the candy jar's glass sides. Conversations paused when Clara entered, then resumed at lower volumes as neighbors processed her presence and decided how to react. Mrs. Henderson emerged from behind the counter like a general taking the field for battle. Her dress was black, as always, her expression carefully neutral in the way of merchants who couldn't afford to alienate paying customers, regardless of personal feelings. "Clara," she said, using just the first name without title or warmth acknowledgement without acceptance. "What can I help you find today?" Clara produced her carefully written list, items arranged by store section for efficient shopping. "These things, please, and I'd like to look at your winter wool. Jacob mentioned you might have new stock from Denver." The transaction proceeded with businesslike efficiency. Mrs. Henderson filled Clara's order without comment, weighing flour and measuring coffee beans with mechanical precision. But Clara caught the older woman's eyes lingering on her wool coat, noting its quality and what such garments cost, and what their purchase implied about changed circumstances. Other women drifted closer during the transaction, ostensibly examining merchandise but actually studying Clara's appearance and manner, looking for signs of moral decay or evidence that respectability was as fragile as they'd always claimed it must be. "That pattern suits you real nice," ventured Mrs. Morrison. The preacher's wife. Her voice carried cautious approval, as if she were testing dangerous waters with one toe. "Blue brings out the color in your eyes." Clara smoothed the fabric with genuine pleasure in its texture and weight. "Jacob helped me pick the shade, said it matched the morning glories growing by our front porch." The casual mention of Jacob's opinion, the easy domesticity it implied, sent ripples through the gathered women like stones thrown in still pond water. Men who helped choose fabric were men invested in their wives' appearance, men satisfied with their household arrangements. Mrs. Henderson counted Clara's payment with careful attention, examining each bill as if checking for counterfeit, though they'd come straight from Jacob's account at the local bank. "Everything appears to be in order," she said finally, as if surprised by this development. "Usually is," Clara replied, mild as morning milk. "Jacob's taught me to keep careful records of expenditures." She gathered her packages and moved toward the door, aware of eyes tracking her progress, but no longer caring whether those eyes held approval or disappointment. The town's opinion had once shaped her daily existence like iron bars, but now it was simply background noise against the more important reality of her actual life. Outside, Jacob waited with the wagon, packages from his own errands loaded in the bed alongside supplies for winter that stretched ahead. He helped her up onto the bench with automatic courtesy of established routine, their movements coordinated by months of shared tasks and mutual consideration. "How'd things go in there?" he asked, guiding the team toward the edge of town where open country began. Mrs. Henderson actually seemed civil for once. Mrs. Morrison nearabout smiled. Clara arranged her skirts as the wagon found its rhythm on the rutted road. "Think they're starting to accept that I'm not disappearing anytime soon." "Good," Jacob said simply. "Never much mattered what they thought, but it's easier when folks aren't working against you for sport." Storm clouds pressed closer as they drove toward home. First fat raindrops spattering against the canvas wagon cover. Clara didn't mind the weather threatening. She'd learned to appreciate the rhythm of seasons, the way autumn storms promised winter rest before spring renewal. Time had taught her that difficulties passed like weather fronts, leaving clear skies for those patient enough to wait them out. Ranch buildings came into view as full darkness fell, windows glowing yellow with lamplight and the promise of warmth waiting inside. Clara could see smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, where the men would be playing cards and telling stories while wind rattled the walls outside. Jacob unhitched the horses while Clara carried packages into the house that no longer felt like someone else's property she was borrowing. The kitchen welcomed her with familiar scents and comfortable arrangements, everything positioned where her hands could find it without conscious thought. She lit the oil lamps with practiced efficiency, their warm light pushing shadows into corners and making the large room feel intimate despite its size. Outside, rain drummed against windows that reflected her image back, a woman at home in her own space, competent in her own domain, partner in an enterprise she'd helped build through daily choices and accumulated small victories. Later, after dishes were washed and tomorrow's bread dough was rising beneath damp cloths, Clara and Jacob sat on the front porch swing despite the weather. Rain fell in silver sheets beyond the overhanging roof, turning the barnyard into temporary lakes that would drain away by morning. "Storm's already breaking up," Jacob observed, pointing toward gaps in the cloud cover where stars showed through like scattered salt. "Be clear weather by dawn." Clara settled against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him through her wool shawl. His arm came around her naturally, without conscious decision, the way partners supported each other when rest was earned and peace was possible. "Think I'll try that new bread recipe Pete mentioned," she said, her voice quiet against the drumming rain. "The one with cornmeal that makes loaves stay fresh longer." "Sounds fine by me," Jacob replied, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of a man whose daily concerns were manageable, whose home ran smooth, whose partnership had proven itself through seasons of testing. "Men'll be grateful for anything that tastes like food instead of wood shavings." Clara smiled against his shoulder, breathing in the scents of leather and honest work and the clean mountain air that surrounded their valley like a blessing. She'd earned her place here one day at a time, one meal at a time, one small competence built upon another until the sum total equaled belonging. Not because she'd changed who she was at heart, but because she'd found where who she was could flourish. The rain gentled to whisper, then stopped entirely. Stars emerged, bright and sharp, in the clear mountain air that made everything seem possible, somewhere in the darkness. Night birds called to each other across the valley, their voices carrying ancient rhythms of home and safety and peace, hard-won through honest effort. Clara closed her eyes and listened to Jacob's steady heartbeat beneath her ear, to the small sounds of a ranch settling into sleep, to the vast silence of country where she'd finally learned to stop running from herself. This was home, not the buildings or the land, but this partnership built on daily choice, respect earned through consistent effort, love that grew strong through shared work rather than pretty promises that faded with time. She'd found what she'd never dared hope for, a place where she belonged completely, exactly as she was. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but about ordinary folks choosing to see past surface judgments, to recognize the worth that lies beneath. Clara's journey from social outcast to respected partner reminds us that transformation happens not through sudden change, but through daily choices to keep trying when everything seems impossible, In our modern world of instant opinions and social media trials, we often forget that every person carries stories deeper than their reputation. We judge based on fragments of information, past mistakes, or social status, rather than present character and future potential. Clara's story challenges us to look beyond the labels society places on people and recognize the dedication, resilience, and hope that can flourish when given genuine opportunity. Jacob's quiet leadership demonstrates that true strength lies not in judging others, but in creating spaces where people can grow into their best selves. His partnership with Clara wasn't about rescuing or changing her, but about building something together that neither could achieve alone. This story, inspired by tales of the American frontier, is created solely for entertainment purposes and does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.